Good evening and welcome to Talk of the Stacks. I'm Christy Pearson with Friends of the Hennepin County Library. As the library's nonprofit partner, we raise awareness, appreciation, and financial resources for our world-class library. Now, for those of you joining us for the first time, Talk of the Stacks is a free author lecture series produced by Friends with guest authors who focus on the craft of writing, as well as urgent social, economic, and global topics. Tonight, we are honored to welcome the beloved New York Times columnist, Margaret Renkl, author of the new collection, Graceland at Last. But first, on behalf of the library and Friends, we'd like to begin tonight with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that in Hennepin County, we live and work on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. This land and the Dakota people belong together. And by offering a land acknowledgement, we affirm Dakota sovereignty and we aspire to hold ourselves accountable to the work of reconciliation. Well, I would next like to recognize our generous sponsors who help make this free series possible. A special thank you to LSE Architects, US Bank, Knorr Companies, and the Star Tribune for their generous support. Now, with November upon us, and I can't believe that it is, we are once again approaching a time of year filled with connectedness, traditions, and the spirit of generosity. And here in Minnesota, we are lucky enough to have a way to celebrate all three. So good news, Give to the Max Day is the single largest day of giving of the year, will take place on Thursday, November 18th. And library friends from all over will make a gift supporting our library. But you don't have to wait until next week to donate. All donations received tonight through November 18th will count towards our 1,000 friend goal to unlock a $30,000 matching grant. So if you are interested in helping us reach that goal, and I certainly hope that you are, simply click on the link in the chat. Thank you so much for the consideration. Your gift and your act of faith make all the difference. Finally, I have just a couple of tips to pass along to help you better enjoy tonight's virtual experience. If you would like to use captions, click on the closed captioning icon and select Show Subtitles. If you would like to ask our author a question, you can click on the icon marked Q&A to log your question, and you can do that at any time throughout tonight's program. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's guests. Moderator Marianne Combs is an award-winning broadcast journalist, producer, and radio host. She was named the 2020 Journalist of the Year by the Minnesota chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. She has received multiple awards for her investigative reporting, and she currently serves as the managing news editor for Racial Reckoning, the Art of Justice. Our guest of honor, Margaret Renkl, is the celebrated author of 2 books of nonfiction, including 2019's Late Migrations. She is the contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, where her essays appear weekly, and she's also the founding editor of Chapter 16, a community of Tennessee writers and readers. Her latest book, published by our Minnesota-owned Milkweed Editions, is Graceland at Last, Notes on Hope and Heartache from the American South. Shelf Awareness recently raved about this new collection of essays, stating, "Everyone should have a friend like Margaret Renkl, thoughtful, engaged, compassionate, and above all, acutely observant." Please welcome moderator Marianne Combs and beloved author Margaret Renkl to Talk of the Stacks.
Hello, and Margaret, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's such a pleasure to get to talk to you tonight.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Christy, for that lovely introduction.
Actually, I just want to start by thanking you for your work. Week after week, you draw people's attention to important issues like the environment, poverty, the legacy of slavery, as well as the beauty of the earth and the richness of Southern culture. That's a very powerful and important thing to do week in and week out, and to do it for years with such eloquence is no small feat. So thank you for your work and drawing our
gosh.
attention to important things.
Thank you. Gosh.
When you first began writing columns for the New York Times, did the editors have a clear idea of what they wanted from you? Did it take a while to find your voice?
Well, initially I wrote strictly as a freelancer. So I wrote something and I sent it in, and they said yes or they said no. I was lucky. They always said yes. So it was very encouraging. And that kind of process is really different from the kind of process I work with my editor very closely and his editor. And it's just a really different kind of thing now. But in the beginning, after I had been writing just as a freelancer every few months, 4, 5, 6 months up in between each essay, they offered me a slot as a contributing opinion writer writing monthly. And at that time, they just said, don't try to write like anybody else. We already have Maureen Dowd. We already have Gail Collins. We don't need another one. So you just write like you, and we sort of figure anything you find interesting, we're going to find interesting too.
Wow, that's a lovely thing to be told by a New York Times.
It's a really beautiful thing to be told. Now, I don't just get to write anything I want. I have to submit my tentative plan. And if my tentative plan needs some tweaking, that happens before I even start drafting. But yeah, basically that's how it's gone for a few years now.
Was there a period of time where you were trying to figure out if your voice was your voice or not, or whether you were trying to be something else, or was it something where you felt pretty strong in who you are and how you present yourself from the beginning?
Well, Marianne, I was very old when this started. So I had a pretty good long time. I didn't start writing for the Times until I was really well into my 50s. So I had a good, strong voice.
Right, but we're talking about the platform, the very large media platform of the New York Times. And here you're sort of fitting yourself into all of this. Just to me, when I look at that, I find it a little overwhelming to be like, okay, here's my corner of the New York Times, and this is what I'm going to do with it. Even after a full, long life, I would think I would still be a little overwhelmed with how I'm going to make this piece of real estate sing.
No, I guess I don't think about it. My way of avoiding being overwhelmed is to give that question no thought at all. So it's just between me and Peter Catapano, my editor, and Indrani Sen, his editor, and everybody on up the masthead. It's the whole question of the platform. Every now and then that comes back to bite me, because Fox News will get hold of something that they're not happy about and send a newsletter out to everybody, and then they all jump on top of me on Twitter. But basically, you can really easily insulate yourself from knowing how these things are landing. If that's your intention, it's possible to be pretty sequestered from the Sturm and Drang.
I would think that would be a balancing act of insulating yourself just enough so that you're not too insulated from what the world is saying, or how these things fit in your land in community.
Yeah, I think there's when I first started writing weekly, I ran into Ann Patchett in her bookstore, my dear beloved bookstore, Parnassus Books. And she said, well, I only have one piece of advice for you. Don't read the comments. And I said, oh, I don't know. The comments have always been really nice. And she said, no. If somebody can tell you that they're all nice, and 999 of them might be nice, and there'll be one in there, and that'll be the one you're thinking about at 3 a.m. Oh. And she is so right. It's not true that I don't read the comments, but I'm judicious about it. If I can tell I'm mainly making people mad, I don't really need to know anything other than I'm making people mad. I don't need to sit and let abuse be heaped upon me.
Yeah. I particularly admire the way you talk about big issues in a very personal way. When you talk about the environment, you start in your backyard. When you talk about gentrification, you talk about the house your mom was living in when you moved her closer to you. And you don't shy away from sharing pain or grief in watching how the world is transforming around you. That is a level of openness with the audience that I think is also really powerful. And obviously you've been writing for a long time now. This didn't come right away, but when people, I think it was a great comment that that was in Christy's intro about thinking of you as like a dear friend. The voice that you have is very much of somebody who's like a good friend who's talking to me and sharing their observances. I almost feel like it's kind of like I'm reading your journal. It's got that personal, here's what I'm seeing right now, here's what I'm feeling right now. And you're giving us really access into a private world. Is that something that you work on very intentionally and sort of cultivating this sense of intimacy in your writing? Or is it just, do you have somebody you imagine as you're writing these pieces?
I think it's just maybe, I think it is mainly just my nature. I started out as a lyric poet. And when I started writing nonfiction, it was really because it was really the same sorts of things I had been writing poems about at first. And I don't know. I think that's just, I have a strong sense that to meet another human being, you have to be willing to let them meet you. And that, I don't really know quite how to put this, except that it's easier, I think, to bring somebody along to the way you're thinking if you are taking them along with the process that led you there, instead of just, I write a lot of arguments, but I don't think arguments are very effective tools for turning people's minds. I think stories change minds better than arguments do. Arguments are good. They can articulate for other people the feelings or the convictions they have and don't necessarily have the words for, and it can be very reassuring to read something that somebody else has written and say, yes, I feel that too, or that's exactly what I think, or I've experienced that and I hadn't ever thought about it in quite that way. That can be a very empowering experience. But if what you want to do is change somebody's mind, I think you do that better, more effectively, by telling them a story or by inviting them to know why this concerns you.
Yeah.
It's not 100%. It doesn't work on everybody, but nothing does.
And the fact that you're trying with such, I think for me, that's part of the power of this work, is that you are each week making that effort and inviting somebody in to see things the way you do. And it's funny, you say in the book, you're not a reporter, but what you do is very similar. As somebody who has been a reporter for decades, you go out, you report what you observe, you often interview people, you're constantly citing sources and including valuable data. You're regularly using your platform to give a voice to the voiceless, like the environment, or to amplify marginalized voices. So in many ways, you are a reporter of what's going on in the South. But you're also very clear in saying that you are not the voice of the South. You are a voice from the South. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Well, it's not it's sort of the desire for people to assign you this sort of larger role, and your desire not to be that.
I think that my impulse not to be the voice of the South comes in part from my politics, because I think it would be really kind of hideous for an old white woman to say, well, my experience is, that's all that really matters down here. So, I don't want to do that. But I also think that it comes also from my annoyance with the impulse to outside the South to see us as this monolithic region, this place that is either, Mayberry, where everybody is, where you just, Aunt B's gonna bring you, some soup when you're sick, which Aunt B will definitely do down here. But that's not all, that's not all it is. And it's also not only, this place just riven with racism, although there's racism everywhere here. Also, there's racism everywhere there. I mean, it's just pretty much everywhere. So I think that part of why I don't want to even attempt to represent myself as the voice of the South is that there's so many different Souths, and I can't accurately portray them all.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I do want, as much as I can, to use this platform to hand the microphone over. I want to say, though, it's very kind of you to tell me that you think I'm a reporter, but I could not do this job without actual reporters doing their job first. There are stories that I find on my own, but by and large, an opinion writer can't form an opinion without facts. And, in the trenches, reporters are the ones who are digging up the facts.
Yeah. I find it interesting that when I look at your work, and frankly, I sort of tore through the book, and then I just went online and started finding old, more recent columns that you'd posted, just so I could get, enjoy more of this, because it's very satisfying for somebody who has been a reporter for a long time to read, because you have all those traits that a reporter oftentimes brings to a story, but you also have this strong voice infused with empathy and compassion and care, and you're passionate, but you're also, I'd say, you're not strident. You're measured in how you talk about these things. You have strong opinions, but you're not, screaming to the high heavens about something. And so I think the effect is very persuasive, because you have the benefits of all the reporter's information and the story, but you also have the added personal investment and your care and the way you personally write about it that is very persuasive and powerful. I wonder do you ever get you mentioned Fox getting a hold of it. So obviously you do occasionally experience backlash to what you write, I take it?
Oh, all the time.
Really? And what is that like for you? Because when you're a reporter, you have the editorial board that's like, we're here to back our reporter up. They got all the facts, they got their story right. But when it's an opinion writer, how does that work for you? Do you feel a little bit more like you're out there on your own, or do you still feel like you have the New York Times editorial board around you to protect you? How does that work?
Well, I am so grateful for the editorial guidance I get. So if I have turned in pieces that were more strident than the versions that appeared in print. If I'm pretty hot about something, it's really hard to tell whether this is righteous anger in the face of, genuine and unforgivable injustice, or is this, has it slipped over into a more ad hominem sort of attack on people who are, it's a little thin line there you have to find, and I don't always find it, but that's why I have a brilliant editor. And if it goes through a multi-step process. So my editor and I have some, back and forth about what the initial draft I turn in looks like, and then he does some editing, then he passes it on to another editor who asks questions and makes suggestions, and then it comes back to me for another round, and then it goes back to the copy editor. So there's a lot of eyeballs on it before it ever sees the light of day. And that is reassuring, but they're not, of course, not the ones, you know, that people are coming after on Twitter. I guess for me, it's really important to be as informed as I can be, while still acknowledging that I'm a generalist. I'm not an expert in any subject that I write about. And sometimes people make mistakes, but if you make a mistake, then there'll be a correction appended to the article for the rest of time. And so there's a great incentive to double check every link and to make sure that every name is spelled correctly, and to just make sure that it's a fair and accurate representation of every side involved. I can have an opinion that's specific to one side, but I can't misrepresent the other side in trying to make my own opinion more persuasive. I have to do both. I have to represent both sides and then form an opinion.
Has there ever been a negative response to an opinion piece that you were proud of, that made you think, I'm actually getting somewhere? Or that, you know?
You mean, am I happy when I make certain people mad?
Yes.
I would prefer not to make anybody mad. I would really like to be, you know, I don't like to be disliked. I would actually, to be completely honest, I would prefer not to write about politics at all. I'm not even that interested in politics. I follow politics as an American citizen who feels the weight of democracy on her shoulders, as we all do now. But it's not, I mean, there's so many people who just live and die by every little vote or court case, and I don't. But I can't do this job without doing some of it, and I do as much of it as, you know, seems necessary.
In terms of having an impact, do you get signs that your stories are reaching people in a meaningful way?
I do. I used to have more avenues to have that, for people to reach out to me. I did have to shut down the email form on my website, and I had to close off comments on a lot of stuff on social media, just because it can get scary. Mm-hmm. Some of the people I make angry, and I don't mean to imply, even as a liberal, that the only people who I make angry are conservatives. I make liberals really angry all the time too. So I get it coming and going, and there's just only so much of that you can take. But sometimes people send letters, actual handwritten letters, to Milkweed, my beloved Minneapolis publisher, and they'll pack them up and put them in an envelope and send them to me. And I always write people back. It sometimes takes months, but I always write back, because it is, it's just, that's what you live for as a writer, is to know that you made a difference in somebody else's life.
Mm-hmm. When you began thinking about this book and looking back at your writing from the past few years to decide which columns would be included, did you have any personal discoveries around your work? Did any patterns reveal themselves, or were there any aha moments?
It's amazing to me how quickly I forget, what I've already written. And I have to sound like a keyword search on my own computer hard drive to make sure that I haven't used that same phrase or quoted that same poem or novel or whatever. But I don't know that I saw any patterns I was unfamiliar with. One of the nice things about writing every single week, year in and year out, is that the subjects about which I feel most passionate can recur. It's not like I've had everything I'm ever going to say on the subject of protecting the pollinators, or I've said everything I could possibly think of to say about, how that baby bird does not need to be taken into your house. It's actually being very well cared for by its parents and stuff like that. There's always going to be next spring, when it's time to plant a pollinator garden, and there'll be some news story or some little hook that will let me write about that again.
Yeah, you there are actually a couple of different passages I was thinking of as you were saying that, and you were talking about your strong politics or your strong sense of justice and speaking on behalf of nature. You end one of your essays by saying, the only thing that will truly reverse these life-threatening, science-denying policies is the collective will of the American people. It will require all of us, whatever our politics, to force our government to protect our birthright. Preserving our oceans and rivers should not be a partisan issue. Protecting the land that sustains us should not be a partisan issue. Protecting the air we breathe should not be a partisan issue. And it's up to us to defend our rights because these are our rivers and these are our skies and this planet is our home. So beautiful and powerful, all while talking about an important issue. And it said, you say it will require all of us, whatever our politics, to come together on this issue. How hopeful do you feel about all of us coming together at this stage in the game?
So much of what divides us right now is language. So if you ask people, for example, if you were to just ask people, if you were to phrase the question, do you think industry should be regulated even if it kills jobs to keep the pollution out of the air? A much lower percentage of people will say that they agree with that policy. But if you ask them, would you like to breathe polluted air? Then a lot depends on how it's framed. So things like just the words climate change have become very divisive, but people are, this is the thing about nature. It is not open to spin. If water's coming in your bedroom window from a creek half a mile down the road, that. If you don't want to drown in your bed. And so the need to protect, to restore waterways so that there are natural buffers and to prevent flooding, people can understand that. It's just that the language has become politicized. And so I don't know how hopeful I feel that the politicians are ever going to do that, but I think people are going to do that. The Republican Party does not support the Endangered Species Act. They would like to kill it. They would like to render it completely powerless, but people support it. An astonishingly high percentage of people support the endangered species, something like 70%. So I do think both things. I think, no, it's not going to happen. And I also think, yes, it's definitely going to happen. And it depends on whether I'm talking about the politicians or my neighbors.
And just a follow-up paragraph to that, because just a few pages later, I found this where you said, I grieve what is happening to the natural world, and I understand perfectly well that my own efforts to help are far from enough. But when I watch a bluebird introducing his mate to the nest box I've installed for them, it's impossible to give up. When the tiny hummingbirds make it back from far across the Gulf of Mexico, it's impossible to give up. And a seedling muscling through the soil, carrying its old sleeping self into the light, never fails to give me hope. It never, 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 never fails. I love stumbling, because I feel like so much of what you're doing is you're journaling, and we all feel those moods. We all go through those points where we have to do this. Oh my gosh, this is never going to happen. It's impossible. Oh, but we have to hope. We have to continue working towards this. So for me as a reader, it was a very empathetic journey I went on with you through all of this, which was just incredibly moving for me. I think I teared up a few times in this book because I was just like, oh, I've been in this exact same mental state, and I feel it, that desire for things to go a different way, that feeling a lack of control over, but also feeling I've got to live my life in accordance to my values, even if everything looks like it's not going to go anywhere, positive. What can we do but just try? Which I feel is so often sort of the message is to stay strong and to keep doing the things that are important, even if things look a little bleak on the general landscape.
Well, we're not ever just one person, we're not ever just Pollyanna or Eeyore. we're always Pollyanna and Eeyore, and somewhere on that continuum on any given day. I do have, there are times when it's very discouraging, when I think, oh gosh, I'm never going to have grandchildren. Nobody's going to ever want to bring children into this world. And then other times when I think, we are just the most ingenious, innovative species. We can do this. We have done such amazing things before, and we can do this too.
Mm-hmm. Most of the essays in this collection were written during President Trump's tenure in office. And at one point you likened it to the death of compassionate democracy by 1,000 paper cuts. So 10 months into President Biden's tenure, how are you feeling about the political process now?
Good and bad. I mean, I will say that Joe Biden was not my first choice for the Democratic nomination, but I am glad he got it now. I'm not saying that I wouldn't have been happy if my candidate had won also, but I think that there's something about him that's very steadying and very reassuring to people. I have so many Republican friends who did not vote for Donald Trump in 2016, but they also didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. They just didn't vote. They didn't see anything in her platform that they could find a place where they belonged. But with Joe Biden, that's not true. Now, partly that's because they'd had 4 years to see what happened, what sitting out caused this country and this world. And so that was part of it. But I know so many people who will say, I'm still a conservative. I'm still a conservative. I just don't recognize this Republican Party. And, I think that Joe Biden was maybe a gift for them. Now, as far as how he's doing, some of what he's running up against is just the usual ugly stuff, like this infrastructure bill that just passed. It was a bipartisan infrastructure bill in the Senate, and then the Republicans in the House just decided they did not want to deliver any kind of legislative victory to President Biden, even though their own constituents stood to benefit tremendously, and even though their colleagues in the U.S. Senate voted for the very same bill. And so that's politics as usual, at least in the world we live in now. And so I don't know that we can necessarily evaluate President Biden's performance exclusively on the basis of what he's accomplished, because he has so many forces arrayed against him.
Yeah. And the state, I guess a better question would be, how do you feel about the state of politics these days?
No better. I feel no better. Do you?
I may feel worse. I don't know. I think people had expectations coming out of, with an end. Well, of course, people had expectations like 2020, finally say goodbye to 2019. And then we had the pandemic and then, finally, we're saying goodbye to President Trump, and we're going to have, and now we have just this debacle in Congress. So it's hard. I think it seems like there is a battle going on at the nation's capital that doesn't necessarily reflect, as you were saying, what voters are interested in. How you have like 70% support for something, but you don't see that being represented at the nation's capital.
Well, I don't think that politicians necessarily, certainly Republican politicians don't feel obliged to vote as their constituents. They here in Tennessee, the support for expanding Medicaid is extravagantly high, and they are still not expanding Medicaid. I mean, people want help, and if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that going without health insurance is really, really dangerous. And, these are their voters, and they still won't expand Medicaid. I don't get it.
I just want to take a moment to remind the audience that you are going to have an opportunity to submit your questions, or you have that opportunity now. We're going to have a Q&A section coming up towards the end of the hour. So just a reminder to get in your questions now and not wait until it's too late. And you can use the Q&A icon at the bottom center of the screen. You say the South is changing, that it has always been so much more than this monolithic stereotype that many people have of it, but that diversity is continuing to grow and the South is transforming. What transformations are giving you the most delight these days?
Oh, I love how ethnically and culturally diverse the South is becoming. It's always been ethnically diverse. We just, and culturally too, but we just, there wasn't a, the media wasn't covering that reality, and now it is. But it's also true that, like in Nashville, for example, we have the largest Kurdish population outside Kurdistan of anywhere in the world. And it's, a Kurdish American artist just won a big prize that the Tennessee State Museum gives. It's lovely to see all these different parts of the world and all these different cultures come into the South and introducing us to the world. I love that. I also love how much we have managed, and I don't know for how long this will be, to embrace these newcomers without losing entirely a sense of ourselves and the people we have been. And so it's kind of this, it's not a melting pot. It's more like a patchwork quilt, and everything gets to remain what it is, but also be part of the fabric of something bigger. And I love that.
Mm-hmm. You write about how the South is viewed by the rest of the country. It's sort of this, we may have our problems, but at least we're not like the South. We don't have it that bad kind of thing. I wonder how the South views the rest of the country. For instance, when George Floyd was killed by Derek Chauvin last year, something that, Minnesota is obviously still reckoning with. What were the conversations like in your community about that, and perceiving, the way the North is dealing with racism or not dealing with racism?
Well, it was not news to anybody down here that they did not have a monopoly on racism.
Mm-hmm.
That might have been news to y'all, but it was not news to us. That's part of it, is that, when there are a lot of Black people outside the South, and the reason they're there is because of the Jim Crow laws in the South. But they did not, and when during the Great Migration, when Black people left the countryside in the South and went to the cities, went to Chicago, went to Detroit, went to Minneapolis, they did not find people who were just really thrilled to have them there. They did find jobs, they did find public schools that were better, but racism, if you ask anybody who's Black or brown, they will tell you that racism is everywhere. And so, the conversation that happened here was about racism here. I think that was the whole effect of the George Floyd's murder, was that every community was reckoning with racism in their own community. We have enough to deal with here without having to worry about y'all's.
Being from the South, you are, I think, however, more comfortable with conversations about race than the typical Minnesotan.
Really?
Yeah, I've had more than a few Black friends say that when they visit the South, it can be refreshing, in part only because at least there they know how people think of you.
That's pretty sad. Yeah.
Here the saying among some people is, Minnesota nice, they'll give you directions to anywhere except their own house. That's, the idea of, oh yeah, I'll help you, as long as it doesn't mean like any sense of radical hospitality or engaging in a personal relationship. What do you think Northerners or Midwesterners in particular would do well to learn from the South?
That's a question I've never considered. I've been pretty defensive, I think, in my life and sometimes in my writing about the South. And in the sense of trying to explain to people outside this region that this is a very complex and nuanced culture. And I wonder, I don't know if that's something that's also true outside the South. Would people outside the South know or feel that there was so much going on, both said and unspoken? Or is that just something we've always lived with because of the legacy of slavery?
What about welcoming the stranger, Southern hospitality?
It's a real thing. It is.
And so, I mean, I think about that in terms of what could we learn from that, and how could we embody that or maybe practice that better? What could we learn from the South around that?
The national perception of that welcoming the stranger or Southern hospitality is that it's race and culture specific. And I think to some degree it can be. But I also think that, most Southerners, if they have two of something and they know you need one, they will just give it to you. If they have one of something and they know that somebody needs something, they will tear their one in half and give the other half away. What they don't want is to be told they must. And that is a distinction that's not always very clear to people outside here, that you could be personally generous and personally welcoming and still not want a law codifying that you must be. And that is a hard thing to explain.
You also say that there is, you talk about the idea that in the South, somebody can, it's easy to love or maybe this is not true of just the South, maybe this is us too, but just this idea of you can love an individual, but not like the group they represent.
You can love an individual and fear the group they represent. And I think I wrote about that in connection specifically with the LGBTQ community, because, everybody nowadays knows somebody, patronizes a shop or has a friend who has a child who's gay or bi or trans, and it's just not, nobody lives in these little silos that the media sets out for us. You don't actually live in that place. But when it comes to saying, okay, I do support gay marriage, if your preacher is telling you that this is some kind of violation of God's law, what are you going to do? It's a problem.
I also think it's interesting that you point out and you really point the finger at white Christianity, very specifically white Christianity. And I wonder if, and you talk about sort of the what I want to say, the sort of cognitive dissonance around what is supposed to be, acting like Jesus or following the Bible, and then this sort of behavior that feels to be the antithesis of that. In your community, is that something where you see change or progress? Is that something where you feel like, oh, maybe we're finally in this day and age, we're shifting things? Or does it feel like people are sort of digging their heels in and, you know, taking solace even more so in the beliefs that they've taken solace in up till now?
Well, I think it's important to note that, first of all, my criticisms of white Christianity come from my identity as a white Christian. So this is not an outsider
Right.
pointing fingers on the way in. But I grew up in the Catholic Church. I grew up in the Catholic Church in Alabama, where there was a Church of Christ directly across the street from our Catholic school, where the children would stand on the sidewalk and tell us that we were all going to hell. So it's not like there's only one brand of Christianity. There's a lot of different kinds of Christians, and that's true here as well as anywhere else. So I did not grow up in a Christian tradition where any of that stuff would have been said. Catholic schools in the South were integrated years before public schools were. For all of its closed-mindedness on sexual issues, Catholics have always been very open-minded on what we think of as social justice issues, on immigration, on criminal justice reform, on feeding the hungry, all of those things. So but my grandmother and grandfather were Methodist, and my great-grandmother was Baptist. So I kind of got it all. And as far as whether things are changing, that I don't belong to these. I have never even stepped foot in a mega church. So I can't say from any personal experience that they are, but I have seen no evidence that there is change in that community. I have to say that white men have always been in charge, and they do not wish to cede their power. And so a lot of what comes across as what is being taught as biblical injunctions are really just power protection moves. And that happens in conservative and evangelical churches. What I was writing about, and the thing the essay you referenced, was about the way the Christian churches in the South have always participated in the suppression of justice, suppressing the rights of women, the rights of Black people, the rights of gay and trans people, the rights of immigrants. This has always been their MO. There's nothing new about it. There were churches preaching during the Confederacy that it was God's will that some people remain in slavery and others own them. And so it's not really surprising that that power is still being protected by these churches. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but it is. I don't foresee there being any really big changes. People in power always want to keep their power.
I wonder, because you talk about, within your own community, and again, we're talking about these big issues, but you also refer very much to your personal experiences. And I wonder if there are people in your sphere that you're seeing them
budge on those issues.
Yeah.
I do think I saw a lot of not necessarily change, but consideration during the Trump years, because the president of the United States was exemplifying on a daily basis the exact opposite of the very characteristics that Christians try to instill in their own children. And so I think there was a lot of struggle. Like there were plenty of people who were going to vote for him in 2021 because, or voted for him in 2016 because they wanted Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court. But that didn't mean that they were okay with some of this other stuff. And how do you reconcile that? And there was I was talking with one friend of mine, and I said, I don't understand how you could support him. Every single thing she's an evangelical Christian, everything you stand for, he has stomped into the mud. And she said, well, I'm a flawed human being, and I believe in redemption. I couldn't get out of bed in the morning if I didn't believe in redemption. So I think there was some mental gymnastics happening pretty much on a daily basis during the last 4 years. And I have to say, I think enough people changed. Not a huge number of people. I think mainly, Joe Biden won because more people came out and voted. But I do think there were some people who changed.
One last question before we go to our Q&A section. We've got some lovely questions lined up. As we enter the holiday season and this sort of season of gratitude, recognizing that we've all been through some tough times these past few years, what are you most grateful for?
What am I personally most grateful for?
Yeah.
I'm grateful for almost everything. I'm grateful for my family first. I'm grateful for my friends. I'm grateful that we made it through 4 years of the Trump administration, and some of the things we lost, we will never get back. But some of the things, especially in terms of the environmental ramifications of that presidency, those are being rolled back. I mean, I wrote this week about the new Ford plant in West Tennessee and in Kentucky to build electric cars. And I think that believe it or not, I don't know why, that gave me so much hope, because I think it's just a sign that this is the reality. This is reality, and people can try to spin it all the way they want to, but that I'm very grateful that people are waking up. I'm so sorry that it takes floods and hurricanes and droughts and fires to do that. But if you look at how the needle has moved just since March, and how many people in the Yale University has a climate science and climate communications program, and they do these, I think they do these polls twice a year, and the needle moved dramatically in terms of the number of people who say they're very worried about climate change. And that, gosh, what more could you ask for? That's a Christmas present right there.
Yeah, what an interesting gift. Well, fabulous. With that, I'm going to open up the conversation to questions from our audience, and we have several up here. Jean writes, I loved late migrations. How do you learn to be so observant of nature? Any suggestions on how to become more observant?
Well, my first suggestion is always to take the earbuds out. And I say that because I can't have a conversation with a neighbor anymore, because everybody has their earbuds in. It started during the pandemic, I think, when people were working mainly from home and they were walking the dog and on a conference call. But so many people can't be still, and they can't listen. They can't, and I'm guilty of it too. There's a local photographer, nature photographer I follow on Instagram, and he took this remarkable picture of he knew there was a hollow in this tree, and he knew there was something down in that hole because the other birds were mobbing it and fussing. And so he just waited, and he said it took him only 10 minutes before the little screech owl popped its head up, and he got a picture of the screech owl in the little where it was trying to sleep through the day. And I remember thinking, he said only 10 minutes, but how many people, it's Graham Gerdeman, by the way, if you want to follow him on Instagram, he puts these great pictures up there, but how many people could sit still for 10 minutes and wait to see what was going to pop out of that hole.
Hmm.
I think we've gotten so accustomed to the rhythms of the 21st century, and we want always to be listening to a podcast or watching a program or scrolling, and I'm as guilty of it as anybody. But the great thing about the natural world is that it works on these very different rhythms, and if you can surrender to those rhythms, whether it's sitting on a park bench and watching the pigeons, or it's standing at a window and watching a bird feeder, you breathe better. You just you can feel your muscles relaxing, and then that's when you start noticing.
Mm-hmm. John Scollin has a couple of lovely questions here. He writes, were there key times, events, or people in your education that particularly moved you toward your career work?
You mean like mentors, you think?
Yeah, or just events in your life that, that said, oh, I need to do this. I guess I'm a poet. I guess I'm a writer now.
Well, I was always a poet. One of the great things about being born into my family, my parents were old by their generation standards. My mother had me and I'm the oldest, when she was 30 and my father was 33. And that was really, really unusual when the year they got married, when my mother was 20, almost 29, the average bride was 18. So it was just a really different time. And they were, they were the kind of parents that our generation is. They were all in on parenthood in a way when, everybody else was just like, go away, I'm going to play bridge or whatever. My parents, and I said I wanted to be a writer, and they were like, great. And they bought me a typewriter at a garage sale. So I've always wanted to. I guess what changed from that to the kind of writing I do now is when I had 2 miscarriages, one really late miscarriage, between my first and second children, and I was put on bed rest when I was pregnant with the baby that became our second child. And the medication they gave me, first of all, I was sure I was going to lose this baby too. And second of all, I had to take this medication. They don't prescribe it anymore, but to calm the contractions, that started when I was 22 weeks pregnant, and it made my hands tremble. It must have been some kind of speed. But anyway, I couldn't write poetry. The focus, the mental energy, I just didn't have it. And that's when I shifted and started writing prose, because let's face it, it is a lot easier to write a sentence than it is to write a poetic line. And I guess once you've gone back to the easier kind of writing, you don't ever want to go back to the hard stuff. So that really was the pivotal change.
Having been a poet, do you find yourself turning to poetry occasionally just for freshness or conciseness, clarity, or a change of pace in your life? And if so, which poets?
Do I, as a reader, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I read poetry all the time. I love Ross Gay. I love a lot of poets here in town. Kate Daniels is a poet whose work I love. Mark Jarman, Tiana Clark. I love Mississippi poet Beth Van Fennelly. I love what do I think? And sometimes I go back to, I love Shakespeare. I could just read Shakespeare for fun all the time. There's something about, I don't know, whenever my writer friends go, I don't know why I'm writing this, it's so stupid, why would anybody need to read this? I go, nobody needed to write anything after Shakespeare, and yet we, aren't we glad that people did? So get over yourself and just keep on writing. And I think I think that's good.
Has the absence of a collective consensus of what is fact changed the way in which you approach your columns, your opinion pieces?
No, because there is fact. There is such a thing. Whether there's any consensus on it, in some quarters, it doesn't matter. That these things are not up for debate. I don't quite get how we got to the point where somebody could look at a photo and say, you're right, there are more people standing on the mall at this inauguration than at that inauguration, when patently, to the visible eye, there are more people on the other lawn. So, that doesn't worry me at all. Mm-mm.
Wow, that worries me even more so, because I'm like, well, okay, if they're not seeing facts, I can keep on writing facts, but is it going to change anything? I mean, has the conversation just gotten so far off to one direction that there's no hope of reaching those people anymore?
Well, those people were never going to read my column. And they just would not. My very first piece I did on assignment for the Times, I went down to downtown Nashville to a Trump rally, and the doors were supposed to open at the auditorium, or I think at 7 p.m. Well, the talk was supposed to begin at 7, and the doors were open at 6, and I got there at noon, and the line went, all the way down the block, around the block again, down the rock. It was just this ridiculous line. So I walked up to the people at the very front of the line, and I said, I just was curious, how long have y'all been standing here? What time did you have to get here to be at the front of this incredible line when the doors don't even open for 6 more hours? And he said, who are you writing this for? And I said I was doing a story for the newspaper. I specifically and deliberately did not say which newspaper. And I said, well, it's for the New York Times. And he said, no, I can't talk to you. The New York Times is fake news. And I said, well, here's what I'm going to do. I've got my recorder app open. I'm going to make sure that I have the quotes perfectly accurately. I'm going to take your email address and your phone number, and I'm going to call you or email you, your choice. I'm going to read you what I said, what I have down that you said. And if I didn't get it right, you can correct it. I would never, ever write something that wasn't true. And he said, oh, I know you wouldn't, honey, but the rest of them, I'm not going to have anything to do. So, they're not reading the New York Times.
Yeah. As Sue writes, do you see racism changing in the South? If so, in what ways?
Well, I think this is the kind of place where I can get into real trouble, because I think that it is important to acknowledge progress where progress has been made. And I was born in a time where children could be marching for peace and justice, and the police chief of the Birmingham Police Department could turn fire hoses on them and dogs. That is what racism looked like in the 60s in Birmingham, Alabama. It is what it looked like. There were state troopers on horseback clubbing peaceful demonstrators all over the American South. And so I can't understand how it's productive to say that things are as bad as they've always been, when it is patently not the case that things are as bad as they have always been. Does that mean that things are good? It does not. Things are not good. But racism looks different now. People don't like being called racists. People can believe that because they are courteous to people of other races, and because they don't want to keep their children out of school with people of other races, that they are not racists. Racism is a lot more subtle than that now. And so it's hard for some people to understand that they do still participate in racist ideas. They don't get it. And that is itself a form of racism. Mm-hmm. But is it changing? Of course it's changing. Everything's changing. Everything's always changing. The question is it getting better? And is it getting better fast enough? And I think we probably have stalled out a little bit, and it hasn't continued to get a lot better. And it's frustrating and enraging because that's the case.
Yeah, you're talking about language, and now we're talking about critical race theory as, these hot button words that sort of change and reframe the conversation. It can be very...
Well, nobody's teaching. that's just a completely made up bunch of hooey. Nobody's teaching, nobody. The most liberal teachers in America are not teaching critical race theory to elementary school children. That's a college course. It's not a public school. It's not a matter of public school discourse. That's just Fox News trying to deflect people from things that really matter, like, whether or not they're making enough money working 40 hours a week to actually pay their rent and feed their children.
Yeah. All right, last question. Elvis is the king and Graceland is our version of, nice.
I'm ready. He
Yes,
is
Graceland
king.
hug. Elvis is the king and Graceland is our version of some kind of paradise. Why do we in the South, this must be a Southerner, Kathleen, still claim him as our guy, even though he went to Hollywood and Las Vegas, etc.?
Well, I think that Elvis he was dirt poor. He grew up absolutely dirt poor, and he grew up to be an icon, and he built for himself this house that a dirt poor kid from Mississippi would think was a mansion. Now, if anybody in just any regular run-of-the-mill suburb in any prosperous city in America were to go and visit Graceland, they'd be surprised by how small it is. It's the kitchen looks like the kitchen you might see in a double wide mobile home. It's not extravagant like you see on Zillow, and so in some ways I think that Elvis is kind of the American dream, but for Southerners. That's what I'd say.
And Graceland's not in Las Vegas. Graceland.
It's in Memphis, Tennessee.
There you go.
And kind of a shabby part of Memphis too.
I should give folks a quick reminder. If you'd like to purchase Margaret's latest book, Graceland at Last, please click the link in the chat to order from independent bookseller Majors and Quinn, one of our beloved local bookstores. Thank you for buying local. Your purchase supports our incredible local literary community. Maybe you can also pick up Late Migrations while you're there. And, but more importantly, I just want to say thank you again, Margaret. This has been a delightful conversation. I feel so grateful that you made us your last stop on your tour for this book.
The grand finale.
The grand finale. Here we are.
Thank you for such great questions, Marianne. I think you know this book better than I do. You read with such a generous heart too.
Oh no, truly. It truly is like sitting down with a friend and talking about issues that we care about together. And I just love spending time in your backyard and noticing the birds. And it just really was a lovely, lovely read. And so thank you for that. And now I'm already a subscriber to the New York Times, but now I'm clicking and refresh for your updates for when your latest column comes in, which is a lovely thing to be like, oh, I got to see what Margaret's writing now. I love your last one was about, you're turning 60, but you still feel like you're 22.
Well, don't we all?
Yes. Well, in some good ways and some bad ways. It's like, I should have figured out more by now.
Exactly. That's it. Now, I had this professor when I was at Auburn, and she was in her 60s and I was, 20. And she told me that she always has felt 16, but I think I got frozen more at 22. I don't even like to think about myself at 16.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Thank goodness we can still grow and change. So with that, I should bring this program to a close. Thank you so much, Margaret, for sharing your time with us this evening and for making us your last stop on the tour. We'd also like to share one final thought before we close. If you enjoyed tonight's program, a new season of Talk of the Stacks is just around the corner. Click the link in the chat to register for the first event for the 2022 season, featuring legendary explorer Will Steger. Steger visits Talk of the Stacks for a virtual event with his niece Rita May and local writer Beth Dooley to talk about their new cookbook collaboration, The Steger Homestead Kitchen. That sounds like fun. On behalf of Friends of the Hennepin County Library, thank you for joining us tonight and have a great holiday season. Margaret, again, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, and thank all of you.
Have a good night.